In my mind, the most revolutionary feature of CSS Grid is it allows us for the first time to lay things out in the third or depth dimension in the viewport. By that I mean we can literally stack elements one on top of the other inside the grid to create previously impossible layouts. Let me show you a practical example using a figure, some pseudo elements, and an image. What you're seeing here in the browser is just a figure element. There's nothing fancy here. There's no dividus, no like multiple divs nested inside one another. Looking at the markup, we have a figure that wraps around an image and then a fig caption. And inside the fig caption, there are three elements. There's a block quote, there's a cite, and there's a regular paragraph. Now, if you look at these items as I scroll over them, you'll also notice that they are positioned specifically within the viewport, and that's all achieved using grid. So if we go and look closer at this figure, you can see that there's a grid applied to it. If I activate the grid here and then activate the line numbers, we can see what's going on. So there's an overall grid around the entire figure, and all the elements within the figure are positioned on that grid. So now we can go in and look at each item in turn. So here we have the image first. The image is placed using grid columns 4 and 5, so that's number 4 and 5. And grid rows 3 and 4, so that would be 3 and 4. So that's placed in the main grid. Then the fig caption here actually contains its own grid. So if you look closely here, you'll see inside fig caption, it says display grid, and we can activate that grid as well. It's a grid that sits inside the main grid. Here's the second grid. And inside that grid, we then position the block quote, the cite, and the credit. So that explains the main content, but what on earth is going on with this yellow background thing here? Well, that's also positioned on the grid. If we look closer here, you can see it sits here, but that doesn't appear in the markup. There's no element for that background, and it's definitely not a shadow because it's placed inside the grid. It's actually an after element. So that's a pseudo element that's been stacked into the grid. So here we have card, : after. Then the content is nothing, the display is block, and since we are placing it inside the grid using grid column 1 to -2, again, I'll display the line number so you can see it, line 1 to -2, so that's, if we count it backwards, you can see down here, -1, -2. And then we display it from 1 to -2 in the rows too, so that's from 1 to -2. Then we can position it exactly where we want it within the grid, and then we just use z-index to dump it in behind the other content. This setup now allows us to use a simple figure to create a very advanced three-dimensional layout with multiple layers, because there is actually a third layer here as well. It's this before, and the before is again positioned on the grid, just in a different position. It's sitting between lines 2 and -1 and 2 and -1. And then it has the background color white, but we can change that background color to something else. You can see it. So here we have another element that is independent of the card itself and can be placed in. You can put an image in it if you want to. You can put text. You can do whatever you want. And all of this is made possible by this grid stacking. We are literally placing items one on top of the other inside the grid and then displaying it as if it was just one cohesive element. This is really quite magical, and the most magical part about it may be that if you turn the grid off, so if we just say, take away display grid, and scroll down, and then take away the other grid as well, so that would be here, you'll notice the fallback to content when grid is not displayed is acceptable. Of course, I would add some additional fallback styles here to get rid of this yellow background, for instance, but because we're using a pseudo element to generate that yellow background, it just doesn't appear when we turn the grid off because it doesn't exist within this context. So using grid and stacking things vertically allows us to do things that were previously not possible without adding a bunch of extra markup. That's the most revolutionary part of CSS Grid, in my opinion.